I recently described a friend of mine on Twitter who had changed his mind about COVID as being a better man than me because he had changed his mind. And he challenged me on it, saying that I had done more than him. But I disagreed, saying that the world didn't need more men like me. It needed more men like him. Because in my periodic moments of doubt, I wonder that if it could be proven to me that all my fears were unfounded, that everything was fine, and I could just concentrate on enjoying my life, whether I would be able to change my mind as he had done. I'd like to think I would, and you'd think that being released from all this worry would be enough of an incentive to take the blue pill, but I can't say so for sure. As most of you will be aware, I am in the happy position of having Mrs. X by my side. She is by my side in almost every way, and so I count myself as being particularly, as well as generally, fortunate in that regard. But for the purposes of my YouTube activities, I am specifically fortunate in that she is on the same page as myself. I know that some of you are not so fortunate, since you tell me so, and you have my sympathy. I cannot even begin to imagine how difficult and isolated I might feel if my life partner were disengaged, apathetic, narrative swallowing, or worse, a narrative or COVID zealot. But Mrs. X is perhaps even further along the narrative denial path than I. 4 or 5 years ago, BC, before COVID, she was bringing things to my attention that only became obvious once the COVID hysterics fully got into its stride. And we used to have conversations where she would ever so gently mock the things that I still believed in. Even the word mocking is too strong, such is the respect with which she conversed with me. It was really more of a tease. And this was usually triggered whenever Princess Diana flashed up on either of our timelines. Before COVID, there were what I called the 4 major conspiracies: JFK, the moon landings, the death of Princess Diana, and of course the attacks in the US on September the 11th, 2001. 4 years ago, my position on each of these was far clearer than it is today. I've always thought that the official story of the Kennedy assassination was just too full of holes to ever be believable. I had never really believed that the moon landings were fake, and that blaming Osama bin Laden for the World Trade Center attacks, although implausible, seemed far more plausible than anything else, particularly if that anything else involved hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans conspiring to murder thousands of other Americans. But the event that I felt most sure of was the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in a high-speed collision in a Paris underpass in August of 1997. I felt sure that it was just an accident, although instead of blaming the driver, which in terms of convenience I felt rivaled the shooting of Oswald by Jack Ruby, I blamed the press, and particularly the paparazzi photographers who seemed to be in hot pursuit right to the end. But it wasn't the details that convinced me, it was the attitude of the conspiracists. They so wanted to believe that Diana had been murdered. They desperately wanted it to be so, and as far as I could tell, they wanted it to be so because of their view of Diana herself. Diana was a victim and a heroine to them. She was a tragic, and as it turned out, a doomed tragic heroine. They wanted her to have been murdered because it fitted their image of her. It wasn't because they had studied the evidence, or so I believed. It was because they were emotionally attached to the idea of the tragedy having a meaning. In doing so, it turned her into a martyr, and that, I think, gave people some sort of perverse comfort. Her dying in a car accident was meaningless, as all accidents are. But her having been murdered by a callous and calculating British establishment, perhaps with the knowledge even of the sovereign herself, because she somehow represented a threat to that establishment, comes with it bucket loads of meaning. And I included Mrs. X in that. As I've said before, I was never a particular fan of Diana, believing her to be spoilt, flighty and attention-seeking, and having won the Charles versus Diana PR battle, mostly because of her undoubted physical beauty. But Mrs. X disagreed, taking the more conventional line that she was an innocent and naive young woman tricked into a marriage with a much more experienced man to be a broodmare selected for her bloodline and her virginity for the sole purpose of producing a male heir for the Prince of Wales. So we would disagree about that, often passionately, with neither of us giving ground. And one of the ways I was teased by Mrs. X was in my belief that the royals would never do such a thing. I would often dress up that belief by saying that one of the reasons I believed that was because if it was ever revealed, it would very definitely be the end of the monarchy. And I'm still doubtful of the Diana was murdered theory because of that. But I was concealing, or trying to, the feeling that they wouldn't do that because, well, after all is said and done, they're human beings, just like us. But Mrs. X saw right through that and continued to tease me about my naivety. But she continued to believe what she believed, and I continued to believe the more or less official story. But over time, and particularly after COVID, and after many similar conversations, I've begun to realise why she thinks the way she does, and why I believe the things I did. I grew up in the 70s and 80s and had a very stable and increasingly prosperous upbringing in the southeast of England. I had what one might term, without much exaggeration, an idyllic childhood. I lived in a rich part of a peaceful and prosperous country, surrounded by an extended family of adults who loved and cared for me. In modern parlance, I had what might be described as white privilege. I was certainly privileged. There's no argument about that. And like most people, I'm yet to be worthy of that privilege. Mrs. X, however, grew up in a once prosperous country torn to pieces by a vicious and bloody internecine civil war that caused her to be separated from her mother and shipped off to live with a collection of self-serving and malevolent adults in England, both familial and institutional, that shaped her personality in a way that was radically different to mine. Without going into any details, but bluntly put, she has been unsurprised by the callous and inhumane behaviour that has shocked me these past 3 years. Consequently, she considers it not only possible, but likely that the hearts of those at the top of the British establishment are indeed black enough to do such a thing as murdering a princess. In fact, she thinks me incredibly naive to believe anything else. And it's a curious thing in our corner of Wonderland. Normies are quick to smear us as conspiracy theorists. But what's also remarkable is that mention that you think that 9/11 was as described, and you will be smeared even more quickly by those on our side as dupes. There is an intolerance of divergent opinions by some on our side, as total as there is from the Covidians. Is everything a conspiracy? I used to think that, logically speaking, that couldn't be so. But now I'm not so sure. I can't imagine ever believing that the world is flat, but I find myself adopting a wait-and-see approach to almost everything else. Disbelieving the official line on JFK, the moon landings, Diana, 9/11 and now COVID is hardly a fringe position anymore. But believing in chemtrails, alien visitations, elite paedophiles and the vaccines as a bioweapon certainly is. However, after 3 years, almost everything that was branded as misinformation, disinformation and unhinged conspiracy theory eventually turned out to be true. So it appears to me that if a conspiracy theory hangs around for more than, say, a week, it will eventually come to be accepted as fact. Unless the great majority of people are unaware that what they thought was true actually isn't, which I suppose is what we are actually facing. The lie, the big lie, is presented as fact, and loudly so. Those tiny number of people who know that it's a lie are sidelined, ignored, or silenced, and so that tiny number gets seemingly even tinier. But there always does seem to be a very hard core that never shut up, but by this time they are dismissed as cranks. The lie carries on, the majority swallow it wholesale, and then once the lie has done its job, it is then gradually and increasingly left unprotected to be exposed at leisure by that tiny hard core. But by this time, the issue is deliberately ignored by the media, and no one is interested. Nobody is fired, nobody is arrested, and nobody is held accountable. The money has been made, the arms have been jabbed, the unpopular and unpalatable policies are enacted covertly, whilst everyone is focusing on the big lie, which can then be quietly left to die a natural death. And all those who were fooled don't get angry at having been lied to, but instead no longer want to talk about it, perhaps because the subject leaves them feeling complicit. After a suitable amount of time, those who went along with the lie, and even those who enthusiastically pushed that lie, feel comfortable enough to rewrite history and announce that they were never fooled in the first place. And this is not okay. This is not acceptable. To accept it is to partake in the lie. But there are many ways to partake in the lie. As I've mentioned before, the reason I keep doing this is so that there is a record of my resistance to all this. And that remains my primary motivation. But I have also been partaking in the lie in my own small way, and that's by not speaking against the lie enough. Nobody likes to be the person who's forever going on about COVID. Nobody likes to be that person. That's how you stop getting invited to places. But those people are the real warriors, the ones who make everybody else feel uncomfortable. The genuine white knights are the ones who are forever going on about it, despite the social opprobrium. But I'm guilty of not doing that, or at least not doing it enough. Of course, it's asking a lot of people to be that person all the time, but we should all be that person at least some of the time. In fairness, if you were that person all the time, the invitations would dry up and you would end up on your Jack Jones back on the internet in no time. So there is virtue in limiting your rants. But we should compare ourselves to those who are prepared to take genuine risks, even if it's just to become a temporary social pariah. Of course, there are many who have risked a good deal more than that on the subject of COVID and not. Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, Mike Yeadon, Pierre Corey, Maajid Nawaz, Tommy Robinson and Tess Lawrie, to name but a few. But as I've said many, many times, we don't have to be heroes. We just have to be men. And women, of course. But it is our primary duty, particularly as men, to protect others. And I like doing my YouTube stuff, and it irks me that I can't do more of it. But like I say, it's a record. It gives me a sense of purpose, and I like to think it might help others to resist in their own ways. But it does have its limitations. It is an echo chamber, as is Twitter. And I got comfortable in that. And for that reason, I cannot be said to be risking anything except a YouTube ban, which would hardly be the end of the world. And because of the relatively small size of my following, I can fly somewhat under the radar. Those with larger followings, perhaps including those for whom it has become an income, that threat of deplatforming is a much larger one. And the other thing is, I'm self-employed. I don't have a boss. I can, in large part, say what I think. That, I suppose, is not true for others, and that rare courage to be the one lone voice speaking out at work has not been seriously tested. In my younger days, I used to work at sea, and that involved flying to different parts of the world in order to board the ship. If I had been still doing that in early 2021, would I have been coerced into taking the jab if the certainty of not complying would be the loss of my job? That's something I can't truly answer. But I do know someone who can answer it. Mrs. X. And partly because, in the words of an old brummie, I held my manhood cheap in comparison. I decided to get out of the echo chamber and start talking to the, as it turned out, mostly uninformed or misinformed general public. I started a stall in my local town. And the response has been generally favourable. We rarely get into arguments, and most people tend to agree with us. But it does depend on the questions you ask people. If we ask somebody, for instance, whether or not they trust the government, we only ever get two responses. Either they say, of course not, or some variation on that, or they laugh. We never get anybody who says that they do trust the government, which is strange, considering what has happened these last 3 years. But strange as it is, there is an obvious in there, because either they don't trust the government, or they do, but are too embarrassed to say so. And if they're embarrassed, why? Of course, there is another possibility here that can usually be teased out with further questioning. When we ask the "do you trust the government" question, some, of course, say that the reason they don't trust them is because they, in their eyes, made such a bodge of handling the pandemic. In that, they are taking the Labour Party and mainstream media line in that they believe the government should have locked down sooner, harder and longer. And on more than one occasion, I found myself in the tricky position of believing that I was in the company of an ally, when in fact they are more like the enemy. However, even these encounters are still worth having, since you can usually find more common ground than you'd think. But there is a feeling that we could well be pushing at an open door. It's not a question of truth versus lies, but mostly merely of reach. It sounds somewhat arrogant and patronising to say that we know more than them, but we do know more than them. We're immersed in this stuff up to our necks, and it is our duty to inform the uninformed. And if that means making a nuisance of ourselves, then so be it. But the great thing about doing the stall is that you can do really good work, but still keep it separate from your normal life. We should still try and be that annoying conspiracy theorist from time to time. But if you do a stall regularly, like I do, there is so much more. That is so much more than most other people will ever do. And if enough of us do it, that will be enough. The trouble is that so many people who say they are so concerned do so little. But what we need is more men who have had enough of being disengaged and doing little or nothing at all. What we need is more men who are sick of the lies and the deceit and the unpunished crimes being committed in plain sight. What we need is more men who've had the scales fall from their eyes. What we need, more than anything, is more men that have the courage to change their minds.